So Saru, I know we spoke a little bit about how we were going to curate this evening, and it seemed like it would be a really good idea for Saru to speak maybe for about 15 minutes, give us a little bit of a background and a history about the organizing work that she's been doing, and I think just to frame some of the discussion that we may want to be having, and then I will engage with her for a wee bit, but the idea is really to have as much of an open conversation as we can with all of you. And so I'll try to moderate that just by recognizing questions and so forth. But please do feel very, very welcome to engage and ask questions. I think this is an extremely important moment for us to have Saru with us. And I think that will become evident why. She's been working centrally on questions of labor and questions of identity and on organizing low-wage, poorly paid and invisible workers, which is an absolutely essential issue for our time. So really thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I stand up because I'm short and I can't see you all and I like to see you? Is that okay? Is that okay? Great. Well, thank you so much to Barnard for having me, to Anu and Victoria and everybody who put this together. Really, really appreciate it. You know, it's been a very hard couple of weeks for me, for us, for my family, for our organization, I think for our world, not just our country. So, you know, I will share more about what we've been thinking about, but I agree with you, there couldn't be a more important time to be together and to be talking about these issues than right now. So a little bit of background, my parents are immigrants from India and I grew up in East LA. I ended up going to UCLA undergrad and then to Harvard and Yale I went to the Kennedy School for Public Policy and Yale for law school. And I was doing organizing and social justice work that entire time from high school through college and all of that. And ended up actually while I was still in law school working at an immigrant worker organizing center out in Long Island, New York, when 9/11 happened. And on 9/11, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center Tower 1 called Windows on the World. My co-founder, Mamdouh, who's sitting here, worked there. You want to wave? He was the head waiter and shop steward at the restaurant. And right after the tragedy, well, on that day, 73 workers died in the restaurant. They either jumped to their deaths or were literally evaporated inside the restaurant because the plane hit below Windows on the World and the heat rose so quickly that workers were evaporated very quickly. So 73 workers died that morning, and about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks that followed 9/11. And in so many ways, we've been talking to employers, and it really does feel like another moment like that now. We just commemorated the 15th anniversary of 9/11, and in many ways, we're the last 2 weeks in particular, we're going through a similar feeling in our industry here in New York. But I think what is hopefully inspiring about the story I'm about to tell you is that we built something really extraordinary out of the ashes of tragedy, and I think so much can happen right now as well that involves hope and possibilities for the future. So we started this little relief center, Mamdouh and I, in the aftermath of the tragedy, initially to help the workers who had lost their jobs get back on their feet, the families of the 73 victims. And what started as a little relief center that we called ROC, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, has grown over the last 15 years into a national organization. We now have 18,000 workers, 200 restaurant owners, and several thousand consumer members, all fighting for better wages and working conditions in this industry. And so as you can see, we've grown geographically. We're now in about 12 or 13 states around the country. We've grown numerically in terms of the numbers of people we're touching, but we've also grown in terms of our stakeholder base. And I want to come back to this because early on we realized that we wouldn't be able to win such a huge industry. We're up against such a big fight. We wouldn't be able to win with only one stakeholder group of workers. We would really need to surround the industry and build bridges across people that you might think would never come together, could never bridge a huge gaping divide as we're experiencing now in this country. We managed to do it and do it successfully. So The reason that we grew so fast over the last 15 years really has been the explosion in this industry. The restaurant industry right now is the second largest and absolute fastest growing sector of the US economy. We actually just hit the 12 million worker mark. So 1 in 11 Americans currently works in the restaurant industry, and 1 in 2 Americans, 1 in 2 of us, has worked in this industry at some point in our lifetimes. And yet, despite the industry's growth, in fact, it's one of the only industries to continuously grow over the last many decades of ups and downs in our economy. It's one of the only industries to continuously grow, even in huge places that have lost huge numbers of manufacturing jobs, like Michigan and much of the Midwest, the Rust Belt that's so much in the news these days. The one industry that's growing in the Rust Belt, and frankly everywhere across America, is the restaurant industry, growing at such large proportions and numbers that we are actually right now experiencing the worst labor shortage in our industry in actually US history. So huge growth, and despite that growth, we continue to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States. So every year the US Department of Labor puts out a list of the 10 lowest paying jobs in America, and every year 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs in the United States and the 2 absolute lowest paying jobs in this country are the people who touch and serve our food. So I want to pause for a minute and help us think about what does it mean to have one of the largest and fastest growing sectors of the US economy, in fact, the second largest sector in America, proliferating the absolute dirt bottom paying jobs in the United States. It means that we are single-handedly responsible as an industry for growing the low-wage floor of our economy, such that 1 in 3 working Americans currently works and lives in poverty. And by 2021, 2022, people estimate it will be 1 in 2. Half of all working Americans living in poverty. What does that mean for this industry? Who's going to eat out? What does that mean for our GDP as a nation when half of America is living in poverty, having to rely perhaps on public assistance, not able to survive? What does it mean when half of the nation can't provide for itself? And that growth from 1 in 3 to 1 in 2 is due almost entirely to this one industry, the restaurant industry. So we've done a ton of research, and we've written a couple of books documenting how is it that you've got one of the largest and fastest growing industries in America, actually, and one of the most profitable, which is something that you don't often hear. You often hear the restaurant industry crying about how they're the lowest profit margin industry in America, and in fact, they're one of the most profitable industries in America. So how is it that you've got one of the largest and fastest growing sectors of our economy proliferating the absolute lowest paying jobs? All of our research shows that it is due to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA, because it's the trade lobby that most people haven't even heard about, but it is the 10th most powerful lobbying group in Congress. The leadership of the other NRA, of course, is the Fortune 500 chains, in particular Olive Garden, McDonald's, Yum Brands, which is KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut, and maybe of some surprise to some, the 4th leader in the other NRA is actually Disney, one of the most evil companies in the United States and, in my opinion, in the world. So these companies lead the other NRA. They have lobbied for over a century, and this is the part that was news to me in writing my most recent book, Forked. I had always thought the power of the other NRA as a trade lobby dated back 30, maybe 50 years. No, come to find that their power dates back 150 years to the emancipation of the slaves. Because it turns out that tipping as a practice did not originate in the United States, it originated in feudal Europe. So I'm a bit of a nerd. I read a lot of Old English literature. If you ever read, Jeeves and Wooster, or any of these old, references to, the past, you will see references to tipping. It was always noblesse oblige, something that an aristocrat gave to a feudal serf or vassal, something always that a superior gave to an inferior, but always on top of a wage. Keep that in mind, because when it came to the States, it was mutated. It came to the States in the 1850s and 1860s when rich Americans traveling to Europe wanted to come back and show off that they knew the rules of Europe, And when they came and they tried to tip people in America, there was actually massive resistance. This is around the time of populism, populist movement in America, late 1800s, early 1900s. So successful, so powerful, this populist anti-tipping movement, that 6 states actually passed complete bans on tipping. They said it's un-American, it's undemocratic. You should get good service regardless of how much you can afford to tip. And by the way, employers should pay their workers and not consumers. And in fact, Tocqueville, when he was here, said this is one of the most amazing things about America. They have rejected this vestige of the feudal system. They're a truly democratic society. There is no tipping. And so it was initially rejected, but 2 industries actually squashed that populist movement, that anti-tipping movement, which actually spread to Europe, was picked up by the labor movement in Europe, and succeeded in Europe, which is why you see so much less tipping in Europe. Here in the United States, we went in the exact opposite direction because 2 industries, 2 very powerful industries, the restaurant industry and the Pullman train company, both demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves and not pay them anything at all and let them live on customer tips. And that idea that tipped workers, former slaves, could be paid nothing at all based on this ugly racial history of valuing people of color at a $0 value was actually codified into the very first minimum wage law that passed in 1938 as part of the New Deal, which said tipped workers could get a $0 wage. Now, if you know anything about labor history or racial justice history, you might know that for the Pullman car porters, they formed the first black union in the United States, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, led by A. Philip Randolph. They won the right to an actual wage rather than relying on customer tips, but the restaurant workers were not so lucky. They started with a $0 wage in 1938, and the law said that as long as tips brought you to the full minimum wage, they could earn that $0 wage, which you have to understand is a mutation of a feudal concept. Because in feudal Europe, workers always got an actual wage from their employer, and tips were on top. We mutated that concept because of our ugly slave history. It went from a $0 minimum wage in 1938 for tipped workers to a whopping $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States. It is between $2.13 at the federal level at the bottom and $7.50 here in New York State. It is a sub-minimum wage in 43 states in the United States. Now, 7 states in the US have rejected this legacy of slavery altogether. One of them is where I live, California. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska have all rejected this legacy of slavery for the last couple of decades, have said, no, everybody needs to pay the same wage with tips on top. Let's return at least to the feudal system. This is what California is doing. And we find that these 7 states are actually faring better on every measure than New York and the 43 states with lower wages for tipped workers. Higher restaurant sales per capita, higher job growth in the industry, higher job growth among tipped workers. Even higher rates of tipping. We actually tip better on the West Coast, if you look at the data, than New York and the 43 states with lower wages for tipped workers. So how is it that at the federal level and in 43 states, including some of our largest and bluest places, you've got wages as low as $277 in our nation's capital of DC, $283 in the blue state of Massachusetts, $283 in Pennsylvania? How has that happened? It's happened because this powerful trade lobby has essentially argued for about a century, it's okay. Tipped workers are wealthy white guys working in fancy fine dining restaurants in Manhattan. They earn $100,000 or $150,000 a year. There's no reason to actually pay them a wage. When in fact, 70% of tipped workers in America are, guess who? They're women. They are women who work at Applebee's and IHOP and Olive Garden. They are women who actually receive a minimum wage, including tips, of about $9 an hour. There are women who suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the US workforce, use food stamps at double the rate. They are women who are about 40% single moms, mostly adults, median age is late 30s. And they are women who suffer from the absolute worst sexual harassment of any industry in the United States, because when you are a woman who gets $2 or $3 or $5 or $7 an hour, your wage is so low it goes entirely to taxes and you are living completely off your tips. Our members tell us all the time, I get a pay stub that says this is not a paycheck, it says zero, because their wages are so low, they're going entirely to taxes, they're living completely off their tips, and when you live off your tips, you must do whatever the customer tells you, whatever, you must tolerate however the customer talks to you, or touches you, or treats you, because the customer's always right, because the customer pays your bills, not your employer. We have done so much research on this. We actually first surveyed about 6,000 or 7,000 workers and found that only 1 in 5 said that they experienced sexual harassment. So we did a whole new study together with a group called Forward Together. We asked the question differently. We said, have you experienced sexual behavior in the restaurant that is scary or unwanted? And 90% of both men and women said yes. Meaning what? Meaning that for most workers in this industry, including, I'm sure, many college students, there is such a fine line between doing your job, pleasing the customer, being a good hospitality worker, and actually experiencing something illegal, unethical, immoral, and totally unacceptable. Such a fine line that after we published this report, a professor from UNLV, who actually moonlights as a waitress because she doesn't earn enough as a professor, wrote an op-ed to the New York Times titled, "Can You Be a Feminist and a Waitress at the Same Time?" saying after she read our report, she realized that she had been experiencing sexual harassment. As a feminist academic, she herself did not recognize what she had experienced as sexual harassment because there was such a fine line between what she was asked to do and what she was actually valued for as a tipped worker and what is illegal, unethical, or immoral. In fact, in this study of 1,000 workers, we compared the 7 states that have gotten rid of this system with the 43 states that have not, and found that women in states like New York experience twice the rate of sexual harassment in restaurants as women in states like California, where they get a full wage with tips on top, where they are guaranteed some take-home pay from their employer. And they don't have to put up with everything they get from customers because they know they can get some pay from their employer. Even if it's not a livable wage, they get a wage. We also found that women in states like New York are 3 times as likely to be encouraged by their manager to dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing, as women in states like California, where again these women are guaranteed a wage. But here's the scariest part. Besides the 4.5 million women who put up with this every day of their lives to feed their families, and as I said, almost half are single moms, besides all of those moms putting up with this to feed their families and tips, there are millions more young women, my daughters in this room, young women here for whom this is the first job in high school, college, or graduate school. This is how we learn as women what is acceptable, tolerable, ethical in the workplace. How do I know this? I know because I've given at this point at least 500 book talks around the country, and every time I give a talk, some woman comes up to me and says, you know, I'm now an IBM executive, I'm a professor, I'm a union organizer, I've been sexually harassed recently in my current job, but I didn't do anything about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants. Meaning what? Our industry is teaching young women in America what they should expect in the workplace, what is okay, what is the worst it could possibly be. And so honestly, is it a surprise that 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump? Is it a surprise when half of all working women in America have started their career in this industry, an industry that not only encourages sexual harassment, but you have to understand this, it validates your worth as a woman based on how willing you are to subject yourself to objectification. If a manager is telling you, you do well on this job, if you will put up with being touched or harassed or treated in a certain way, you will do well if you show more cleavage. Then is it any surprise that most women in America, having gone through this experience, now believe it is not only okay for a president-elect to grab women, it is actually perfectly normal, and it's actually what you want as a woman. It is what gives you your worth as a woman, is to be desired in that way. And so, given all of this, we launched a campaign in 2013 called One Fair Wage. We've done about a decade of organizing workers, fighting against high-profile restaurant companies, moving research and policy work, but in 2013 we realized there couldn't be any more important issue for us to fight on than eliminating this legacy of slavery and this source of the worst sexual harassment of any industry. We launched a campaign called One Fair Wage, calling for the full elimination of the lower wage for tipped workers. We put out these reports on the sexual harassment and the legacy of slavery. We got 8 states to introduce legislation on the East Coast proposing the full elimination of the lower wage for tipped workers. Then Congress followed by introducing 3 bills with us, proposing the full elimination. Hillary Clinton came to our restaurant Colors in April calling for one fair wage, and that was followed by her party, the Democratic Party, putting one fair wage on the platform and announcing at the convention that they were proposing one fair wage as part of what they were going to do in the next administration. That was followed on Tuesday, last Tuesday, in the midst of all the despair we all felt, our first big victory. Maine became the 8th state in the United States and the first East Coast state in U.S. history to fully eliminate the lower wage for tipped workers. It was a huge fight, big victory, and about 6 states are now poised to follow: Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, D.C., Illinois, Michigan, and right here we're moving legislation in New York. We just had a day-long event at the law school with legislators, and we are moving this here in New York as well. It's very exciting, but to me, the most extraordinary part of this move has been the amazing employers that we've actually worked with to move this whole agenda. So we've been organizing about 200 amazing, what we call high road restaurants over the last 10 years. Restaurants ranging from very high profile, fine dining restaurant companies to small mom and pop restaurants that have worked with us to promote better wages and working conditions in the industry. Well, we had been growing this group for about 10 years, and last year I sat down with Danny Meyer. How many people have heard the name Danny Meyer before? A few people. Okay, Danny Meyer is probably the foremost fine dining restaurant owner in the country. He owns Union Square Hospitality Group and Shake Shack. He actually just sold Shake Shack. He is probably the foremost fine dining restaurant owner in the sense that he's written books and people really follow his standards in terms of opening and running fine dining restaurants. I sat down with him last summer. I told him everything I just told you in terms of the legacy of slavery and the impact on women. He said, I've hated this system for 20 years. You've just given me the impetus to do something about it. He invited me to speak to all his managers from around the country. They got inspired. One actually decided to be the first restaurant to get rid of this system. The general manager at the Modern, at the MoMA, decided to be the first restaurant to not just eliminate the tip minimum wage, but eliminate tipping altogether. Now, that's not our campaign. Our campaign is not right now to eliminate tipping altogether, but we were willing to work with Danny in his case because he guaranteed that everybody who went to a no-tipping system would make exactly or more what they used to make on tips. And in that case, we were supportive. When he made this move, it got international headlines. The New York Times published an op-ed by me on the slave history of tipping. 2 days later, the New York Times editorial board came out in support of one fair wage. 3 weeks later, USA Today's editorial board came out in support of one fair wage. And over the last 1 year, we've seen 189 restaurant companies move away from the National Restaurant Association to work with us, eliminate the tip minimum wage in their restaurants. As part of this move, for example, we got Chipotle to leave the National Restaurant Association, listen to us, commit to providing paid sick days, paid family leave, and tuition reimbursements to their 80,000 workers nationally. We were able to create so much heat on the National Restaurant Association that a number of large companies started leaving. Tom Colicchio joined forces with us, Alice Waters, Blue Bottle Coffee, so many other large companies, such that we are now seeing the largest rift that we've ever seen in this industry in a moment where we are winning, and then Tuesday happens. And I think there's still tons of hope. Obviously, our campaign and so many other organizers have been focused on the states as places to win anyway. But there couldn't be a more important time to use issues like one fair wage to talk to people across gaping divides. This is the weirdness of it. In Maine and Flagstaff, Arizona, where we won one fair wage, the elimination of the tip minimum wage, you had people in both states vote for one fair wage, the elimination of the lower wage for tipped workers, a gender justice issue, an issue of sexual harassment on the same ballot that they voted for Trump. And so you do need to remember that there are issues we do agree on, regardless of where our minds are at in terms of what we want and who we think will get us there. But there are issues we do agree on, and in places like Michigan, where we are running a ballot measure, or Pennsylvania, where we are running legislation, we are using the unfair wage as a way to have millions of conversations with white working class people, with working class people of color in Detroit and Philadelphia, as a way to say, we agree on these things, and we need to talk about race and gender. We have to have these conversations in an intersectional way. That is the only way we will win. So I don't want to spend the whole time talking, but I do want to say that, you know, for us, this comes down to one fundamental question. You know, 150 years ago, some of the moves that have been happening over the last 2 weeks feel like we're going way back in history, right? We're bringing on an attorney general who wants to take us back to the Jim Crow South. We are putting a white nationalist in the Oval Office. We are doing really weird things. And there's still hope for progress, because 150 years ago, there was another industry, in fact, 2 industries that said to us, we will never be able to survive as an industry if you force us to actually pay our workers. Those industries were cotton and tobacco. And we as a nation said, absolutely not. That is inhumane, immoral, and it's not even a good business model. And so you're going to have to find a different way of doing business. And 150 years later, you have another industry which is thrilled with the new election, but is saying the same thing to us, is saying, we will never be able to survive as an industry if you force us to actually pay our own workers rather than forcing customers to pay our workers for us. And so we as a nation now have to decide, are we going to essentially allow a trade lobby to take us back that far in history? Or are we going to make progress, especially with regard to how a woman is treated in the workplace and how she values her life and her worth? So,
Thank you. You were on fire. No, I think this is extremely important to have the kind of history that you've given us that gives us a sense of the ways in which we might think about questions of class, of gender, and of race, and bring them together. And I guess one of the questions that I wanted to ask you as well, and I have a number of others, but if you could really speak a little bit more to the question of documented and undocumented workers in this industry. So you gave us a sense of the gendering of the industry, the profoundly gendered character of this is a kind of care work, right? And what we're really seeing is a gendering of various kinds of care work. And food is one of the most intimate things. You know, it's what creates sociality. It is what brings people together. And so to have the kind of invisibilization of the labor that actually produces and makes that sociality possible is profound. And so to sort of bring visibility to that, I think, is extremely important. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, in this particular context, the politics of who is in that industry. Yeah. If you can say a little bit more about the divide between, on the one hand, class, and on the other, identity. Yeah. And you're talking about intersectionality, but how does that work? And now we're facing this extraordinary issue of immigration and the ways in which that's creating another kind of a divide. So maybe to start
Sure.
with that, and then I'd like to kind of take you back to the past a little bit as
Sure.
well.
So the restaurant industry is by far the largest employer of undocumented immigrants in the United States. We employ, at the bare minimum, at the smallest estimate, 1.3 million undocumented immigrant workers. You know, that's more than a 1/12 of our whole industry of 12 million. In cities like New York, we estimate it's closer to 45% of all workers in the industry are undocumented. 70% are foreign-born. Remember, not all immigrants are undocumented. So 70% foreign-born, 45% undocumented. There is absolutely no way this industry could survive in any major metropolitan area or almost anywhere in the United States without these workers. And this is the one issue we in the National Restaurant Association actually agree on. There's no way the industry could survive without these workers. Now, they want these workers to stay in a very precarious situation. They want guest worker visas. They want visas in which they can completely control the working conditions of the worker and send them home, and essentially disposable workers. We and the high road employers with whom we work, 200 amazing restaurant owners, all want these workers to have a path to citizenship. All want these workers, at the very least, to be able to stay with dignity. These workers have been in this country for decades and decades. They've contributed to the cuisine of America, and from all continents, not just one. They have contributed actually to the economy. Many have opened restaurants of their own. They pay taxes. So everybody agrees in our industry there's no way that we could survive without them. The question is, in what context do we want them? Do we want them living as second-class citizens with fear, or do we want them to actually be able to stay and work and contribute and be a part of society like everybody else? I think that's the fight on our hands right now, and in some ways, I think as horrific as what is coming will be, it will also be a wake-up call, because I don't think we can continue to live with the kind of dual world that we live in. It is very tied to issues of race more broadly in our industry. We've done what's called match pairs audit testing studies. So we know that there are some living wage jobs in the industry. Those white guys working in fancy fine dining steakhouses that make $150,000 a year do exist. The problem is that they're maybe 5% of the industry, and they're almost exclusively white men. And how do we know this? Well, we've looked at government data, but we've also done what's called match pair audit testing studies. We've sent actually 400 pairs of white and people of color applicants to apply for fine dining restaurant jobs in New York, Detroit, Chicago, and New Orleans. We found that white applicants had twice the chance of a person of color of getting a livable wage fine dining server position, even when the person of color had a better resume. So I called the New York Times when this happens. I said, huge finding, white people have twice the chance of a person of color, even when the person of color has a better resume. The reporter from the New York Times says, well, isn't it that they're all illegal and they don't speak English? So I didn't scream at him at that point. I then gave all the white testers unintelligible European accents. We gave all the people of color testers very slight non-European accents. We found that any kind of accent for a white tester was always a bonus in getting a job. We found that any kind of accent for a person of color was always a detractor in getting a job, because white accents are exotic and cute, and people of color accents are not, even when they're very slight. And so we know it's not status. Me personally, I know undocumented general managers of fine dining restaurants across from Carnegie Hall. If you want to know the name of the restaurant, I will tell you. And I know it's not. Language. I just told you why. It's not status. It's not language. It's purely skin color. In fact, we've had cousins, Latino cousins, where one passes as white and one is darker skinned. One is allowed to become a server, earning $150,000 a year, and the other has to stay a busser, earning $30,000 a year. So race and immigration are inextricably intertwined. But there is one, again, uniting factor about this industry. The federal minimum wage is $2.13 an hour in this country, regardless of whether you are white or not, regardless of whether you're undocumented or not. And so while we need to fight for a path to citizenship, we, parallel to that, need to fight on an issue that unites all of us, which is the extraordinary power this trade lobby has, not only over our industry, but frankly over our democracy.
I think we've got about 10 minutes before you've got to run. No, because she's got to actually jump onto a flight, and so I don't want to keep you from that. And so I'm wondering, I've got a couple of more questions, but I can certainly hold off on that. I wonder if we can maybe have people ask a couple of questions. I'll collect 2 or 3, and then you can respond, just so that we can have the maximal engagement with audience. So, yeah. Oh, you're taking the mic around. Okay. So there was a hand here. Okay.
Yeah, hi. I'm somewhat confused because I know in New York State, Governor Cuomo's talking about the $15 an hour minimum wage. So is that not for restaurant workers? So really? So when he's talking about that, that does not apply to restaurant workers? Holy.
So hold that thought. There was another question here, and then I'll take one more, and then if Saru can sort of collect those and respond.
How do you deal with the health issues if you have no health care as an undocumented worker and you're coughing over someone's food? What is your procedure?
I'm curious if you can talk about what you think is responsible for bringing the legislation to the forefront. Do you think it's the research that you've done? Is it the partnership you found with the employers? Where do you think that voice has really come from?
Yeah. Maybe take one more. Sure. Yeah.
So I recently lost my job, so I've been working a minimum wage job in the meantime. And is there a way, and we're not really being even paid minimum wage because we're supposed to make a commission on things that we can't sell. So is there a way to organize from the inside, and what do you suggest about best tactics without, putting our jobs at risk?
Yep, great. Very related questions. So yes, it's even sadder than most people know. So when the wage went to $15 in March for everybody else, 400,000 tipped restaurant workers, 70% of whom were women, were not only left out of the $15 wage, the compromise that was worked out was that these workers would see a regression in their wages. Their wages would go down as long as everybody else's wages went up. And so we went from tipped workers, mostly women in New York State, being 83% of the wage down to 66% of the wage, meaning that essentially New York State legislated legal gender pay inequity in New York State, valuing women legally at 2/3 of the overall minimum wage. And so what that means is that half of all the women in the minimum wage workforce were left out and saw their wages go down, as a majority male, non-tipped workforce went up to 15. And so the gender gap, yes, we passed $15, and as part of $15, we threw the women under the bus and increased the pay equity gap in New York State among low-wage women. So how did that happen? Why did that happen? It happened because the Restaurant Association was very clever, and as a result of our efforts of saying this is an issue of sexual harassment and a legacy of slavery, they stopped attacking us directly. For years, they attacked us directly. They had set up an attack website called ROC Exposed. They put my 2-year-old's picture up on it. They took out ads in the New York Times, in the USA Today and Wall Street Journal, full-page ads. They did 2 congressional investigations into us. They had a guy following me around the country. So they used to attack us much more directly, and they were failing at that. We were succeeding, and so they changed their tactic, set up a website called Don't Take Away My Tips, and basically put the fear of God into workers, tipped workers, that if they actually received a wage from their employer, they would lose their tips. Which of course data shows the opposite is true. California has a higher tipping average than New York, but they convinced these workers, and they had some of these workers call New York State legislators and said, don't raise my wages, I'll lose my tips. And so legislators had a convenient excuse by which they could go ahead and make this compromise on the backs of women. Now, they might have heard from one or two of these workers, they heard from a lot of our members, but they had a convenient excuse saying, I can't do this because I'm hearing from some workers who are telling me not to. And so to the question of what moves legislation, ultimately what helps us win, it is workers. It is workers. It is workers. We can do research to lift up their stories and say what is really going on. We can do communications efforts to lift up their stories. But ultimately, we firmly believe as a group that does organizing that all change has to be led by the people who are most affected, which is why I co-direct the organization with a restaurant worker of 17 years, which is why of our staff of 65 people, at least 50 have worked in the industry, are recent restaurant workers or current restaurant workers, which is why our movement, all of our movements have to be led by the people most affected, which in my opinion is why we lost this election. Because we didn't listen to the people who are most affected by the economic inequality that we are experiencing right now. Instead, I believe that much of the campaign work ignored the needs of working class people. And so how do we win? We win by taking busloads of restaurant workers and their allies among employers and their allies among consumers, but it has to be led by the workers in much larger numbers than the opposition can organize. And we take them to Albany, and we take them to DC, and we take them to, capitals all over the country. That's how we win. And your last question, sorry, was about health issues. So, 90% of restaurant workers in America and certainly restaurant workers outside of New York City where paid sick days passed, don't have a single earned sick day, which means, and we've done so much research on this, 2/3 of all restaurant workers in New York State prepare our food when they are ill, with everything from H1N1, true story, typhoid fever. We had a member who worked for 3 weeks in a very fancy fine dining restaurant in Miami Beach with typhoid fever, to, pink eye. I could go on. And of course, it's not just undocumented workers who don't have health care. Most of these workers don't have health care. Why? Even with health care reform, which was a good step forward, so many of our workers fell out of coverage because our industry organized something called the 29ers Club, a club of chain restaurants that all committed to providing workers with 29 hours, one less than the 30 hours they would need to be part of the exchanges. And so they got their workers exempted from healthcare reform, which is why our industry is the source of the worst foodborne illness that you will find in this country. So, for example, one of the companies we fight a lot against is the parent company of Olive Garden, which is Darden. And a couple of years ago, Darden got an award from Michelle Obama for being a great place for kids, healthy food for kids, because they started providing carrot sticks along with the breadsticks. And at that same moment that they got an award, a worker in Fayetteville, North Carolina, was forced to work with hepatitis because there was no paid sick days. 3,000 people ended up having to get tested for hepatitis, sued the restaurant, won a huge class action lawsuit, and in that same moment, there were 2 norovirus outbreaks in Olive Gardens in Indiana and Illinois. If you don't know what norovirus is, you really don't want to know. It's called the winter stomach flu. And the CDC reports that 50 to 90% of all norovirus outbreaks can be traced back to sick restaurant workers. So again, you have an issue with undocumented immigrants and their lack of access to most benefits, but you have a much broader issue as well of low-wage worker America not having access either to an earned sick day to take time off when they are sick, or really to health benefits that allow them to take care of themselves even if they can take a day off.
Maybe a couple of more questions, or do you need to?
I have about 2 minutes.
Okay. So ask 2 quick questions, and then she will respond.
So for small businesses, for little local restaurants, how can they afford to give these benefit packages and to pay and have tips?
Yeah. Thank you so much for asking the question, because I do like to share what the opposition always says, and how we can respond. So first of all, none of the bills that we are proposing propose going to 15 or eliminating the tip minimum wage overnight. They are phased in sometimes over an 8 to 10 year period. We're talking about increases of $1 to $1.50 per worker per year. And as I mentioned, the 7 states that have gotten rid of this system over the last many decades are faring better. Even small businesses are faring better. Higher growth, higher restaurant sales, faster growth among tipped workers. And so how did they do it? They did it, 1, because it was phased in over many years, and 2, because as they phased it in, they saw incredible returns, which we're not able to see in a low-wage economy. Higher productivity, much less turnover. In fact, we did a report with Cornell and found that you can cut your turnover, employee turnover, in half when you provide better wages and working conditions. It only makes sense. Workers are going to stay longer if they're treated better and have a chance to move up the ladder. So higher productivity, less turnover, less employee theft, higher morale. So in California, why do you think we tip better? In my opinion, it has to do with you have better service in places like San Francisco, where they're getting a full wage with tips on top, as opposed to places like New York, where they are again having to rely completely on customer tips, struggling from day to day, month to month, season to season, because they never know how to make ends meet. But of course, the restaurant industry likes to say a couple of things. They like to say, 1, the industry would die if we actually had to pay our own workers' wages. 2, nobody actually earns $7.50 or $2. They make $100,000 a year. 3, food prices would go way out of the roof if we actually pay our own workers' wages. Customers wouldn't be able to afford to eat out. And 4, this is not fair to the kitchen staff who are mostly people of color, to give the dining staff a raise. So I've already told you the answer to the first two. Industry doesn't die. Come to California. Please come visit me. I'll take you. There's a restaurant every 2 feet. Two, the industry jobs are not lost. And I've already told you these workers don't make $150,000 a year. They make $9 an hour, including tips. They're mostly women. 3, food costs. I love this because we've actually compared Applebee's and IHOPs on the West Coast and the East Coast, found that they have the exact same prices while they're paying about 10 times as much in California as they are in Washington, D.C. Exact same menu prices. And last, on this issue of this is not fair to the people of color in the back of the house, I love it when they say that because I always respond saying, God did not tell you to put the people of color in the back. That's your racism. That's your discrimination. You have the opportunity to move people of color to the front, and all workers deserve a living wage regardless of where they're working in the restaurant. I'll close by saying for us, all of these workers are professionals. They are skilled professionals like you and me. They are skilled professionals. In other countries, people go to school for many years to be a professional hospitality worker. Here in the United States, these are skilled professionals, whether you're a dishwasher or a busser or a server, you're a skilled professional. It's just that we don't value these workers as the skilled professionals that they are, and we have to start doing that if we want to see a better industry, a better dining experience, and a better country. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was fantastic. That's great.